So here's some of the points that we're going to discuss regarding composition of the frame. So the first thing about composition is that there's not any clear or set rules about composition. When you're framing a shot, there's no, you don't have to follow these rules. You can always play with the conventions. But there are, this is based in photography and based in the movement of the eye, and there's general rules that people follow. So this is just a very basic introduction to framing shots. Do people here have experience with filming or photography? Okay. So the basic rule of photography is called the rule of thirds, and the idea being that you divide the screen into three diagonally, so horizontally as well as vertically, and you always try to frame the action along those lines, or somewhere to the left or the right or on top of one of those lines. So when you have a horizon, for example, you don't want to put the horizon right in the middle of the frame. It's not nice framing for the eye. And if you are interviewing somebody, for example, you would normally position them either, on the left axis here or on the right axis. You don't want to have the person situated directly in the middle of the frame. So this is a kind of very basic rule of composition, and it works well. The other thing to keep in mind is this idea of depth of field. So you always want to create a picture where you're really able to show the depth of the image. And another thing that you can see here is that it's also quite useful that diagonal shots, or things that are kind of framed along the diagonal, is also nice for the eye and appears attractive. When you're framing an interview, there is something called headroom. So that's the amount of space between the top of the head of the interviewee and the edge of the frame. And as you can see, this is an example of shot one. That's way too much headroom. The guy kind of looks like he's sinking into the frame. And shot number two would be average headroom. So you just want to leave a bit of space above the head. And the same thing with what we call nose room. You should always leave space between the person, the subject, and whatever it is they're looking towards, or whatever it is they're facing. So you never want to have the shot framed in this way, where you have somebody looking to the left and then right on the edge of the picture. They should be in the other third of the frame. And it's also the same thing if somebody's walking across the frame. You want to always leave room ahead of them of what they're walking into. You don't want somebody walking and then have all this space coming behind them. That would look bad. So these are just a few very, very basic rules of framing shots.
Also, the headroom, usually you should like this part of the face, like it would pick up the front. Sometimes you find that as well, right?
Yeah, it's sometimes done that you have like a more of a close-up inside the face. It's not done, if you look at most interviews, it's not done. It's a stylistic choice, and it can be done. I have done it in the past as well, but that's kind of up to you. If you want to just stick to the rules, then you would leave a bit of headspace, yeah. So on top of the framing, then we have different types of camera movement. The basic thing about movement is that if you're not very experienced, you probably want to minimize it as much as possible. because it's quite difficult to have a good, smooth camera movement if you're not an experienced videographer. Specifically, zooms, don't use them. I mean, you can once in a while have a zoom that works, but it's very difficult to do properly. It tends to be jerky. It tends to not look very good. So normally you would use the zoom, to reframe the shot. So if I'm over here and I want to have a close-up, close in some detail, perhaps in her hands or whatever it is, then you can zoom in and take another shot zoomed in. If you want to, maybe show some specific detail, something happening far away, you could zoom into it, but it's not a technique that I would recommend to use.
Question.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have, you're interviewing someone, and you are recording with a video, so you cannot do another shooting, right?
Yeah.
So you have to keep on shooting, but this person points to some specific place.
Yes.
So you need to zoom in to make people understand what he's referring to. So you have to do this zoom in, and then when you edit it, it's a bit odd to I don't know, to put a picture there or how to hide the zoom in.
Well, okay. There's a few things around that. First of all, that's called a cutaway. And I mean, you can show it as a cutaway. Just because the person is talking about it at that point of time, it doesn't mean you actually need to film it then. You can film it after the interview is over.
In some cases.
Yeah. I mean, that's normally what you would do if you don't want to cut the interview. The other thing is that when you're doing an interview, you have to keep in mind that most of the time during the interview, you would have images on top of the interview. So, I mean, that's why when I'm shooting, I'm not so concerned about changing the shots, because, I mean, what I will normally do is change the shot between questions. So you have, you might want to start the interview like a medium shot, and then at some points you want to zoom in, maybe if it's an emotional, they're talking about something emotional, so you want to zoom into their face to kind of get the emotions, or you want to get a closer shot, right? But you also have to think that you have some freedom, because you can put other images on top, and then you can, switch back to the close-up shot or whatever it is. But if possible, you can always, after they're finished speaking, you say, oh, I need to get a shot of this. And then you film it. Or even, I mean, of course, if you're shooting with 2 cameras, which is another possibility, you have a lot more freedom, because you can have one camera that's kind of steady. What you normally do when you have 2 cameras is you have one camera that's steady at a medium shot, and then the second camera that is doing the close-ups, like maybe close-ups of their hands, or close-ups of their mouth, or of their face, or some long shots. And if you have 2 cameras, then normally the person who's doing the interview would be the person manning the fixed camera, and then the other person would be getting the close-ups or the cutaways or the other shot options. So pans is panning, and yeah, as I was saying about zooms, is that I mean, it's difficult to make it really smooth. It's difficult to get a smooth zoom, which is part of the reason. It can be complicated. I mean, actually, all of these camera motions, some are easier than others. It will also depend on the quality of your tripod. If you're doing pans or tilts using a tripod, if you have a good tripod and it's well oiled and well set, not too loose, and wherever you can get smoother movements. And you should always, I don't know if I say this later, you should always aim to hold each shot for at least 5 seconds. And so when you start a zoom or when you end a zoom, always make sure to hold the beginning and the end for a long enough period of time that you can use the shots. Pans is like panning across the horizon, so moving from left to right. A tilt is panning up, getting a diagonal, a vertical, top to bottom shot. Dolling and trucking is when you actually move with the camera. And I mean, there's different ways to do this right now. I mean, I often do handheld. I mean, there's a whole question about whether you want to use handheld, tripod, or monopod, and how confident you are or how steady you feel you can hold the camera will impact these choices a lot. Handheld gives you a lot more flexibility and freedom. And I often will shoot handheld or with a monopod, just because it gives you a lot of flexibility of any angle you want to do to get any shot, or if I want to get on top of a table, or try any different angle that you want. But if you are not, I mean, at the beginning when I wasn't experienced, it was very, very shaky. And especially you have to think when you zoom into something, another reason not to use the zoom, when you zoom in, any camera movement will be very much amplified. So it's another reason not to zoom in. Ideally, I mean, it's always ideal to move yourself rather than to use things like zoom. If you want to be closer to your subject, it's really better to get closer. And I think that's one of the main ideas of shooting well, is you cannot be lazy at all. You can't be lazy and you can't be afraid. You have to just get right in there. And not feel like, okay, I need to have this distance, or because a lot of especially with the new DSLR cameras, a lot of the nicer shots will be kind of close-up shots where you can really capture, movements and details. I mean, they capture kind of details so beautifully now that you just have to be ready to move and put yourself in there. So dolling and trucking could be like following somebody, walking around, or they're talking about something. Oh, I was saying that a lot of people nowadays we use shoulder mounts. So that's quite common with the new DSLRs, and they're not that expensive anymore. It used to be quite expensive to get shoulder mounts, but now they're making some pretty cheap. I think there's even DIYs where you can make your own shoulder mount if you really want. So that's helpful. Also, if you have, some of them have these eyepieces, which also helps people to really steady the camera using the eyepiece. So that's another suggestion. And then there's focusing and back focusing. So it's another technique that's quite common now with the DSLRs that they weren't doing. Everybody knows when I refer to DSLR, does anybody know what I'm referring to? Sorry. Digital single lens reflex cameras. So those are sorry. Yes?
Yes, the same.
Of course.
Sorry, guys. Okay, we're just backing up a bit then. So, I mean, traditionally, if you were a documentary filmmaker, the option was between film and video, right? And video camera, which you had very much less control than you would working with film. You were not able to adjust the shutter speed, you were not able to adjust the aperture, which I'm not going to give a complete photography class here, but just to give the basics of how things have changed. So a video camera basically would, mostly would be used in settings that you could still set quite a lot of settings, but you didn't have as much control over the image. Specifically is regarding being able to focus, adjust the focus on the fly. And in the past, I guess 5 years or something, they've now come out with these digital single lens reflex cameras, like the Canon 60D, the Canon 5D, the Canon 7D, well, I guess there's a bunch of them. And they allow you to capture video with more of a filmic quality. So this has led to reducing very much the costs for anybody that wants to film high quality video. And it's also raised very much the aesthetic standards for creating documentary films. Because now, I mean, there's cameras you can get for 1,000 or 2,000 euros, and you can get, you know, professional quality images with these cameras. And it means essentially that the kind of aesthetic standards have changed as to what's considered kind of acceptable video standards. And this has all been happening in the past few years. So it's, I mean, they are, I mean, at the same time, I don't think it's so difficult to learn how to operate them. Anybody that wants to do filming, it might be recommendable to, you know, really practice a bit with the camera and maybe take a little course in how to use the camera, at least how to control the shutter speed, the exposure rates, the temperature of the lighting, so on and so forth. These are elements that I'm not going to discuss today. But you're also able to get really nice, I mean, one aspect, for example, is how you can nowadays control the depth of field. So if I want to have my interview subject in the foreground, and I want the background behind him to be a bit blurry so that the foreground kind of jumps out of the picture, that's possible, and it was not possible before with video. Video had the problem that it made everything look really, really flat.
Yeah, is that post-filming or
while you're filming? It depends on how you set the aperture and the depth of field. So you're telling the camera that you want the focus to be, you know, when you set the focus, like if I set a focus between myself and Yorgos, everything between me and Yorgos will be in focus. So all of you guys will be in focus, and the picture will be somewhat flat. If I set the focus on this projector, in theory, all of you guys should be a bit blurry. And sometimes that's the look you want, because you want, you know, to have your interview subject in focus, but then the background would be very busy. If you could see every single leaf on every tree, it would be overwhelming for the eye. So you.
What do you need to change that while you're filming? Can you switch focus while you're filming, or you have to stop, set again, and film again?
No, you can change it while you're filming. It can be difficult with some of the cameras, because they're not designed necessarily with the viewfinder the way you would want it. So some people get like an external camera to put on, because you can only see like on that little screen, you know. But what actually rack focus is when you switch focus between two items. So if I'm, you know, well, this is not a very good example, but let me think of something. Okay, so I have this computer and this tripod thing. So a rack focus is I have that in focus. This is blurry. I do a rack focus, then this becomes in focus. That becomes blurry. It's really commonly used in film. I don't know if you've seen it. You have two people in a room, and it's like you see one person at the end of the room, then you do a rack focus, and the person in the foreground comes into focus. So it's these types of beautiful, more cinematic techniques that are possible now with the new DSLR cameras. They have another problem, which is kind of related to the next point that I'm going to discuss, which is they're not designed for video, and it's very difficult to capture good audio with those cameras. It's actually a real nightmare. There's not yet any good solution, although I think with the newer models it has improved. Like you do have the possibility to monitor the sound at least, but yeah, it's quite problematic. So, I mean, as far as, I don't know how many of you are actually planning to shoot something, but deciding on the equipment that you want to use and the camera that you want to use, it would depend really much on your own technical abilities. there's no point to have a camera. You know, if you're not going to be using those features, it doesn't really make sense. It's better just stick with something perhaps that will, you know, not give you always such a stupendous shot, but is more reliable to always give you a good usable shot and good audio. If you're a two-man crew, or you have, you know, the possibility to have two cameras, or you're working with somebody else that's a more experienced photographer, and you can do the sound separately, then you have to decide. So yeah, and it's also common, you know, to like be out of focus and then bring a shot into focus, which some of the things also that you can do to a degree in post-production, but yeah, this is. So we have also different types of shots, and it's kind of intuitive. You have extreme close-ups, medium close-ups, medium shot, long shots, and extreme long shots. So here's different types of camera angles. So a close-up would be like the face, extreme close-up would be only the mouth, let's say, or a detail of the hands. And this is usually for more intimate moments, or really to show details. A medium shot would be like, I guess, your classic interview shot, so you're showing half the body. A long shot, you're showing what's going on, you're showing kind of what's the overview of the scene happening. And then you also have an extreme long shot, which is usually referred to as, here is referred to as an establishing shot. So I'm setting the scene for this school today, you know, maybe before she came in the building, she like took a long shot of, an extreme long shot of the center, Pati Limona. So this is the setting of where this entire school is taking place today, right? So we know where we are, we've established where we are, it's called the establishing shot. So this is one example of the type of shots you want to aim to get for. You know, you don't want to. But the basic thing about B-roll is the extra visual footage that you have besides your interviews, and it's when they say B-roll, they kind of, which some people say, I hate the term B-roll. What is this? I mean, okay, it doesn't matter if you hate the term. I mean, it's what people say in documentary film. And it means the different visual material that you have to place over interviews and your basic visual material for the film. And you can't have too much of it. That's the basic rule. The basic rule is you should really be concerned to shoot as much as you can and of as many different things, and not to think of it as an afterthought. That it should be a prime goal when you're making a documentary. Don't think or don't plan as if you're just going to go there and do your interviews and, okay, one interview is going to take me an hour, 2 hours, and I'll do this many interviews and that's it. Actually, you need to devote at least as much time to filming the visual material that's going to accompany the film and go over the interview. So, as Daniela said before, when you're doing an interview, I think, did you guys notice before when we were watching the interview with Lila Lipscomb that there was like sequences, close-ups of her hands, for example, close-ups of like things around the room. So, okay, what do we know about this person? Often, you'll ask somebody if you can follow them around for the day. So you show them, they'll be talking, and you show them in their office, at their desk, or talking to somebody, doing it, whatever it is that they do. Ideally, you can actually, hopefully, film them doing something more interesting than being at the office, because that's a bit boring. That's kind of like when you don't have any of your options. But when you're in the field, definitely try to film them doing their daily activities, whether they're going out, they're working in the fields, and when they're in the fields, you want to get shots from all angles, close-ups of their hands, working, shots of the scenery, medium shots of them working, long shots from all different angles. You really have to, I mean, the more you move around, the more you change the angle and the perspective, the better material you're going to get. Because you can't always tell what's going to work as a shot. You know, you put yourself in one place, you're like, oh, this doesn't work, okay, I'm moving, or this over here. So this idea about cutaways is also specifically referring to, as she said, somebody that something refers to or that they speak to, right? Or, yeah, like in an interview, you kind of cut away to something that they mention. So we talked about establishing shots, and then over-the-shoulder shots or point-of-view shots is kind of to show from the perspective of the person. So if I'm giving a speech, then it's nice to have a shot from behind me, showing the room, so you're getting into my perspective or the character's perspective and showing what they would see through their eyes. I mean, it would depend also whose point of view we're looking at. Are we just going from the director's point of view? Is it more of a character-based film? So do you want to have more shots from their perspective? But these are just different things to keep in mind when you're filming and the types of shots.
So yeah, I missed the difference between the cutaways and insert and POV.
Oh, okay. What is the difference between cutaways and inserts? I was hoping you wouldn't ask that because I'm not exactly sure.
They're pretty much the same, it's even better.
I think it's pretty much the same. Cutaways, as I said, was like cutting away to something that the person was referring to, or cutting away to a detail, like a detail of their hands, or it could be their feet, or it could be, if I'm talking to you also, so we're having a conversation, a cutaway could be your reaction to me talking. So then I'm talking and then there's a cutaway of you nodding or saying yes, or, you know, like, if the camera's on me now and she turns the camera around and gets all you guys in the shot, then it's a cutaway of the audience. POV is point of view.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. When you film from over the shoulder of somebody, you're kind of filming a shot from their point of view. Okay. So here's just a few things to keep in mind when you're filming. So generally keep the frame simple. You don't want too much busyness distracting from the action. So that's part of the reason why I said that you might want to use a short depth of field when there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. You don't want the frame to be too busy. Make sure all your shots are at least 5 seconds long. Do not put people in the center of the frame. Use the rule of the thirds. Generally with interviews, there's exceptions to this. All of these rules, as I said, can be played with or discarded. You don't need to follow any of them. It's just better to know the rules, and then you can flout them if you so desire. But once you have a basic idea of the standards or the conventions. So generally our eyes travel from left to right and from top to bottom of the screen. So depending on how things are positioned in the screen, it will kind of depend on how we view things. So if something's at the bottom of the frame, I will more slowly be drawn towards whatever it is. Drawn to see whatever it is in the bottom right hand of the screen. Whereas if it's coming out at the top left, so I'm kind of moving to see, oh, what's going to happen? No, is there something I should be moving towards something? Is something about to happen there? And then it's you don't want to move to, like, if you're having an establishing shot that's shot from very far away, you normally don't want to move from very, very far shots to very, very close shots. You normally move, from medium shots to close-ups to medium to long shots, to extreme long shots, so on and so forth. So that's another reason why you want to try to get shots, you know, at different distances.
Otherwise, you do a Western movie.
Otherwise, you do.
A Western movie from extremely long to the eye.
That's nice.
That is Western.
That's nice. I mean, that works well. So, you know, this is, I mean, that's when you're also reaching another level, when you can say, oh, I'm making a Western style documentary, because your subject matter allows for that, you know? So then you're, I mean, once you learn the conventions, then you can play with them as much as you want. But better to know them. Okay.
And it says the subject should look across the frame. Does it mean like if the head is in the top left corner, it would look where?
Okay, hold on. I'll show you. I thought I had put an example. I should have put more examples, but I wasn't sure. So, what time do we have to leave here?
5.
5. Okay, we're fine. The basic idea being that when you frame an interview, what we can see, I don't have any more clips, but you can see, is that normally when you frame the interview, you have the subject looking a little bit like this, you know? Like they're looking a little bit at a diagonal, slightly at a diagonal, and not like, you know, even if I'm on using the rule of thirds, I would be positioned, let's say, either to the left or to the right of the film. And actually some people say if you have several interviews, you don't want them always to be on the same side, because then it's like, just gets a bit heavy, like always like same side, same side, same side, same side. And actually you can, in post-production, if you find that's a problem, in post-production you can flip the frame. But if there's any text in the frame, it would become obvious that you had done so. But just to give you an idea of the type of things you can do in post-production, something like that is not generally a problem, like flipping the frame from left to right. But yeah, things to keep in mind. But the idea is that if I'm on one side of the frame, I'm not looking straight like this. You want to show depth of field, right, of the face, and also the subject will often be positioned a little bit, looking across a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit more now about framing for interviews and how to set up the interview. Okay, on to sound. So we have different types of sound. The main ones is the dialogue, which is like the sound that you capture during an interview, or also, you know, just informal conversation happening between the subjects of the film, or the talent, as they're sometimes called. And ambient noise is really something to keep in mind when you're filming. And I cannot stress the importance of sound, because you know, if you have a problem with your picture, if the color is off or the lighting is off, there's often a lot of things you can do to fix it in post-production. You can do makeup, you can, you know, you can do there's color correction that works quite well, and it's pretty easy to do. There's, you know, you can just put different images on top, or you find different images, or you know, when I've had problems before, like you change it to black and white, or, okay, there's more things you can do. If your sound is not usable, then you're screwed. I mean, there's really not very much you can do. So it's an error that a lot, myself included, a lot of filmmakers make, is that they don't put enough attention on the audio. So I definitely recommend to always monitor the sound. Do not think that you can check the sound just using the levels. You should always monitor the sound and make sure that you have a good system for recording sound. As I said before, like with the DSLRs, it's a bit complicated and problematic. So I could tell you some ways to get around it, but there's not any ideal way even now at the moment. So ambient noise problems include sounds like white noise. I mean, are you guys hearing it right now in this room? I hear it. Do you guys hear it?
Yeah.
So it's coming from the air conditioner.
Yeah.
Maybe even from the projector or from. So whenever possible, you know, be nitpicky about people. Be like, oh, can I unplug your fridge? I mean, really, it will make a big difference. You know, I mean, I've been in situations where it's not possible. Like somebody has a generator going, and you're like, this is the only power they have. So I'll just have to shoot with the. Oh, see. it makes a big difference. But yeah, I mean, you should be very, very aware of these sorts of ambient noise problems and try to identify them and to relocate the interview if necessary away from the ambient noise problems. Outside is a good option as long as there's no wind. Wind is another seriously huge problem for ambient sound. So, I mean, most microphones come with a sort of wind blocker that I highly recommend that you travel with if you're going to be traveling and shooting. And even with that, though, it can still be, you know, it can make the audio often unusable. So these are things that you should be very, very sensitive to when you're recording sound. Another very important related issue is called room tone. So every room or space has its own sound that includes the white noises or whatever it is, the noise of that room, the basic hum of the room. So you always need to take let's say at least 10 seconds of the tone of the room. And this is what you use when you're editing over the audio, and let's say I want to cut up somebody's sentence, or I need to create some space, or whatever it is. You need to fill in with the same room tone of the same place that you took the interview. So every time you take an interview or any time you record, you should always record room tone. Don't forget, very important. Okay, the next type of sound that we use is narration. So there's a lot of debate. I mean, this whole question about whether to use narration or not and how much we should let people speak for themselves is also a kind of an interesting topic when you're making a documentary. Actually, the film that I'm working on right now, I decided not to do it without narration because the people I interviewed are very, very eloquent, and you know, they have a really advanced discourse. They speak really well. They're, you know, talking about their own praxis and their own theory. It's an environmental justice film, and I was like, okay, well, I want to let them speak for themselves. But it's makes it so much more difficult, really, to get your point across, because you can't just decide what you want to tell the viewer. You know, you have to get everything out of the material that's already there. I mean, narration, yeah, you're kind of, there's this whole voice of God issue, right? Where, you know, I didn't want to put myself as this authoritarian person. I wanted to kind of let them have the authorship over the ideas in the film without seeming like it was necessary for me to synthesize the ideas and reframe them in another way. I don't know if that's a mistake. I don't know. I showed it to somebody and they're like, just put some narration and everything will become so much clearer, and you know, it was so much easier to structure the film. but it's another artistic decision. And when you are writing from narration, it should be just very basically present kind of the who, what, why, how of the situation. And you have to think that writing for narration is not the same thing as writing for text to be read. You want to write in very, very simple language, and it also, I mean, you should practice your narration before you record it, and some sentences just don't really, slip off the tongue easily. So you want things that, sound very clear and can be read easily. Yeah, and of course, I mean, it depends also on the style of the narration. As we've seen, I think here are some different styles of narration. So it also depends the kind of the style, the mood that you're going for. So we also have, sorry, I didn't include here, but there's also the sound, kind of the local sound when you're recording, which you should also pay attention to, If you're out in the forest, you can capture sounds of the crickets, you can capture the sound of the trees, so you can capture this type of ambient sound that you might want to use in different scenes, either with the corresponding footage or not, over other related footage. And then there could be other types of sound includes music. So the question is how much music you use and where is also an artistic question. The major thing about music is that you should not use any music that you don't have the rights to. Even though you might be able to get away with it, I mean, it's really not recommended, because if the film is a success, or you want to screen it at a festival, or you want to screen it on television, or even if you want to put it on YouTube, you could have problems with the rights for the music. So you should really try to source your own music. And there's a lot of open source music available online with they ask you just to attribute the music to them. Also, I mean, I'm sure you guys know a lot of musician friends or people that make music. So it's really it can make it more challenging, of course, to find the specific music that you like, and it's quite difficult sometimes to find the exact right music or the right ambiance that you're trying to achieve. But that's the basic thing about music. I mean, if you do find a song that you really like and you really want to use it, you can contact the rights holder of the song and ask about getting permission. And sometimes they'll give it to you. I mean, when we used to make student films, we would do that, and because they were student films, they would sometimes say, yeah, you can use you can use the music under these conditions, and it would be possible. But generally, you should only use music that you have rights to.
What about music in the film? If you record, for example, a concert, or like in India sometimes, like they're playing something, I don't know where in village, or if there's a song playing on the radio as an ambient noise type thing.
Yeah.
Then what do you do?
Well, playing in the village is fine. That music is not copyrighted. So there's no problem to use that music, and that's great actually. If you can capture, I highly recommend that. If you can capture music and then use it even in other sequences, perhaps, that's brilliant. It's a great idea. If the music is playing on the radio, it might not be a big issue if it's, if it's not a blatant abuse of copyright.
For example, you're filming a demonstration and they have a music blast machine, whatever that is, and they play stuff. So then what happens?
Yeah, I mean, unless Unless you're actually using the track, most of the time it wouldn't be a problem, unless it was somebody who's, I mean, most of the time they wouldn't find it, or they wouldn't notice it if it's, you know, if it's atmospheric music that's coming from the scene. I'm referring more to like putting music on top in the editing process. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I mean, there is something called fair use, which is the same thing with like on television, right? That if you're filming somebody watching TV and they're watching a small clip of something and you want to show their relationship, that they're watching something on television and they're critiquing it or discussing it, even if you don't have the rights to what they're watching on TV, it falls under something called fair use, which means that, you know, you're using it kind of as a reference point, or even you're allowed to use some few seconds of video. I don't know exactly, I don't remember all the rules, but you are allowed to use, like if I wanted to make a film critiquing how women are portrayed in the mass media, I can use some clips that I don't have the rights to because I'm needed in order to analyze it. So there's something called fair use to that degree. And then there's sound effects, which can also be fun. Most people think that in documentary you don't need sound effects, but actually, yeah, I definitely use them. And there's online free sound effects libraries where you can download all types of sound effects. Like in the most recent film I was working on, wanted to like add like CD radio sounds in one place, or when you have if you do animations, you will also, sound effects can be quite useful, or there's many different types of sound effects you might want to use. So there's also online libraries for that. Okay, then the other sorts of material that you can use. So, archival material. This would really depend on your subject and would require quite a lot of research, and also depend very much on your budget, because there's a lot of archival material available, but it can be quite expensive to access it and to use it. And then there's online libraries, such as, if people are interested, I haven't sent like a list of links of different, for all these things there's online libraries. There's one called the Moving Image Archive, for example. So they have quite a good selection of, it's actually not that great to be honest, but they do have some stuff. They have 1.6 million items, but yeah, most of them are not that great. And
what is this? What did you find there?
This is the Internet Archive Movie Archive.
Yeah.
It's archival images of things that are open access to use. So you can search by keyword or whatever, or search across categories. The problem is, I have used some of this stuff in the past, but a lot of it has become a bit overused, so that you see a lot of the same clips kind of reappearing in many different places, which makes it less attractive, of course. So recently, actually, they just released the entire Prelinger archive, and I don't know if I haven't looked into it yet because I haven't needed it for anything yet, but I don't know if that is open source, and that would be an amazing source of material. The other thing is that you can rip. There's ways to download almost any single video that you want from YouTube. And the question would be depending on the different licenses available. But there's ways to search also for music, for video, for sound effects, even for things like fonts or whatever. images, photos, of course. There's different ways to search to see what's actually in the realm of Creative Commons. So in Google, you can actually search that way. There's many different ways you can search. And most of the material is open for use, but you need to attribute the source, and sometimes it would be only for non-commercial use. So if your film is not commercial, it's not a problem. If it is commercial, you have to read the small print of what is open access and what is not open access. But yeah, you can also use a lot of, I find a lot of videos on YouTube perhaps. You can contact the person if it's not open source, see. So there's lots of potential sources of material if you don't have enough, if you need more visual material for your project. Animation. Well, there's many different ways of doing animation, and I guess I won't really get into it now unless people have specific questions. Yeah, there's many different styles of animation and uses for it in the video. And the other thing that is used quite often in films is the use of photos and stills. And when I first was studying film, we would actually take the still and kind of blow it up and then put it on a board and film it with the camera, so you would get some kind of a camera movement, because it's kind of, you want to have a certain degree of movement in the film, so if you just have the still there, it's quite boring. Maybe you want to zoom in zoom into one detail of the film, so on and so forth, pan across it, or do a tilt. So what they use now, has anybody used iMovie? They have this effect called the Ken Burns effect, which is a different, it's kind of a shortcut that allows you how to add movement to images. And Ken Burns was kind of the first director who introduced that style of filming images in that way, so the effect is named after him. And it's a way of moving across the image, kind of either panning or zooming or whatever it is. And in iMovie, you kind of set where you want the frame to start and where you want the frame to end, and it will do the motion for you automatically. If you're using other editing programs, it can be more complicated, but just so that you're aware that when you're using still images, you have this possibility to add motion, and it actually looks really nice. It can look like a video shots.
Maybe, are you talking about iMovie and other ways of do-it-yourself kind of movie editing, very easy software like that? Is that iMovie is like the software, right, to make very easy movies?
Yeah.
I don't know if people knew that what iMovie was and what kind of software.
Oh, does everybody know what iMovie is?
Yeah.
Well, found out
Oh, sorry. Okay, it's a video editing software. But please, please interrupt me if something's not clear. Is there anything that has not been clear up until now?
Does the iMovie work with Microsoft Windows?
No, it's
So do you have any
the comparable program. Well, to be honest, I mean, up until recently, everybody was using Final Cut Pro, which was the standard for home computer use. I mean, if you're slightly more professional, you might use Avid or other programs. But now, everybody is saying that the new Premiere, which is a Windows-based program, is actually equally good or better than Final Cut. But now Final Cut has come up. It's a big debate, because now Final Cut has come up with Final Cut X, and all the people that used to use Final Cut Pro 7 hate the new one. but it's supposed to be easier to use. And some people tell me it's better, and I haven't been editing recently, so I don't know. I can't really say. But as I said previously, try to avoid editing's the last thing that you want to do. I would say let's cross that mountain when we come to it. Like, if 1 year from now we all have some rough cuts, or we all have some footage shot, and then we say, these are basic things to keep into mind so that when you're shooting, you can kind of plan on what an editor would do. But I don't think it would make sense to get really into detail now, because also from now to 1 year, who knows, there might be a Final Cut Pro Y or Z, and there might be a new Premiere program.
But these are the two, let's say, most prominent program in the
For home
genre.
computers.
Adobe and Final Cut.
Yeah, those are the main ones nowadays. Was there one that we
And these are both not open access.
Not, as far as I know, there is no good open access editing program. But that's a good question. Maybe there is one and I just don't know about it.
There is.
What's it called?
I don't know. I have a friend who did a short video when he was visiting here, and he was editing this, and it was open access, and it's for small, not for like a documentary, but like for small videos. If you wanna shoot a video of something related to your fieldwork that you just can use to show in a presentation, for instance.
How is it called?
I would find
Even
out.
QuickTime, even you can do. I use QuickTime sometimes to do like really quick, easy edits.
Mm.
You have QuickTime Pro, and anybody can access it very easily online. I can tell you guys how, but not on camera. But even on QuickTime, you can take a few segments, put them together. It's very, 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 very straightforward. But you don't even have a timeline, or you have a very basic timeline. But yeah, once you start, in a basic editor's timeline, you're talking about having maybe 2 or 3 layers for video, and then maybe up to 4 or more split tracks for different types of audio, and then another layer for titles. So yeah, you're working with maybe like at least 7 kind of different timelines, one on top of another, right? So, and then titles and credits. Also, if you want to do anything fancy, you're going to have to move to another type of program, because even those editing programs will not do many of the things that you would see here, or any like very basic, anything additional to basic cutting, pasting, transitions. Transitions is how shots are cut and connected between themselves. So the simplest is a simple cut. Then you can have a fade, so one shot fades into another, kind of passing, showing like a slow passing of time, for example. Or you can have a fade in from black, which represents like the beginning of something, a fade out to black, which is at the end. Then you have all those cheesy transitions from like the 80s, and like the wipes and the circle ones, stars. Yeah, in general, don't. In general, just use basic cuts. You don't need any fancy transitions, or you just. In general, you want to keep it simple. Okay, next. Oh, sorry. Any other questions about those basic elements of the film before we pass to the section about interviewing?
I was quite curious to know about the animated infographics. Yeah, which is a bit of a combination between an infographic, so static picture basically, and an animation, right?
Yes.
So, but it's basically an animation. So technically,
I mean, for those sorts of things, you need to, I would suggest to have somebody else do it for you.
yeah. But how are they done?
Well, After Effects is one way to do it. I like in the Life After Growth video, those animations, they were done in Flash. I mean, another way to do animation that actually any of us can do that's really fashionable right now is you guys have seen the RSA animate videos, which is somebody drawing something.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
I mean, this
Or just
actually,
later
I
on.
met a guy the other day that he did an animation about quantum physics, and he drew it himself. And I mean, it does. Any type of animation will be relatively time intensive, depending on how you do it. You know, I guess if you're just adding things in each time you have to take a shot. If you're just drawing, you show the hand, then you can do it faster. But you have to be a good artist, or you find a good artist. I mean, that could be a simpler, cheaper way to do animation. If you know a good artist nowadays to do that style, which I think looks really nice, it's flexible, so.
But,
Yeah.
but now there are also these 3D, very advanced animation. I don't know if you watched the documentary Ecology about Istanbul. It's about urban transformation in Istanbul.
Huh.
And it's really cool because they also, travel on the map of Istanbul, and then certain things that they are interested in jump up, and they are 3D, and then you see the data. It's everything very futuristic.
But it's with After Effects, probably.
See, yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole other field of expertise.
Yeah.
Like your editor will not, most editors are not experts in After Effects. You have people that are specifically After Effects experts. So that's getting we're already getting much more advanced and complicated.
Yeah.
If you have, if you know or you have people that you know can do it, then have you guys seen the documentary ¿Qué es justicia ambiental? Aquí nos vamos a quedar. And that one, the woman who edited that also works in After Effects. So the graphics and the animations that in that one are done with After Effects.
That's one of the EJO documentaries, right?
Yeah.
Is it available in the EJO website?
No, not yet. Not yet. It's on YouTube. I can send you guys a bunch of, if you want after, I'll also send you links to my films and the EJO ones and a few more that we've mentioned or whatever.
I have one more question. When we go to do our field work, but we don't have an idea of a film in mind yet, but we might want to use some material for later, what would be the simplest filming equipment you would advise to take? Going to a faraway place and you can't take a big thing.
Yeah. The simplest thing would be to take a good small video camera.
A camera wouldn't be enough.
A DSLR camera?
No.
Or like a G12 kind of thing? It could be okay, depending on the audio. You won't have great audio. If you were doing that, you would want to film if you wanted to make, you can't monitor the sound on that camera. So you would have no way of knowing if the sound was good or not. You could maybe monitor the levels on the camera, but if you were going to use that camera, then you would want to make sure that the camera was very close to the person speaking, and that would help ensure that the audio would come up clearly, and as I said, be very, very sensitive to any sort of external or ambient sound. That would be the only thing you could do, because you can't monitor it. So.
And what about recordings that you make with a voice recorder?
Yeah, generally they're not, depending on which voice recorder you have, it's generally not, it's not generally usable. But which voice recorder are you using?
I don't really know what.
Yeah. mean, there's a few that are decent, like there's one called the Zoom. The Zoom is pretty decent, and people use that quite often. The Zoom H4n, the Zoom, yeah. So with those two things together, you could have a decent, you could probably get a decent image and audio. And you would want to bring at least a little mount, you know? If you don't want to bring a full tripod, you don't want to have to hold both the camera and the mic at the same time, so you want to be able to mount at least one of them onto something. You can also bring tape. So if you need to, you know, attach something or tape something onto something, always useful. That would be the recommendation. Okay, interviewing. So often when you do an interview, you will also have a kind of pre-interview process with the person, which is not, I mean, it's not always the case, but yeah, it's a nice idea to kind of go through with them the type of questions you might ask them, to find out, you know, if you don't have the pre-interview, you might be missing out on a big part of the story that you're not taking into account. So the pre-interview helps you to kind of understand the basic perspective of the person. There is some drawbacks of having the pre-interview should not be the same as the interview, because you don't want the person to lose the spontaneity, and then when they do the interview it can become seem a bit rehearsed. But it's good in order to set up a rapport with the person and to explain to them what you're going to be filming, the type of questions that you want to ask, so on and so forth. So when you choose a location, you have to keep a few things in mind and kind of balance them. The first one is the comfort of the interviewer. So be very sensitive to, especially placing them if there's sunlight and the sun might be moving and then it will get in their eyes, or, you know, especially when you're placing people outdoors, it can be complicated because there's only certain angles that will work well with the camera, and then placing them in certain angles, so on and so forth. So you want to, and this is mistakes that I've made, and it's quite common kind of mistake. So you have to be aware also of changing weather conditions, and that they should be comfortable. They should be able to sit comfortably. You don't want them to move around too much, or to, you know, if you have a certain depth of field set up, depending on how shallow your depth of field is, if the person's moving a lot, like even moving like this or like this when they speak, their nose could already get blurry, you know? They could get out of focus, depending on how you have your shot set up. So you really want them to be comfortable. And of course, the sound issue that we talked about before. So very important as much as possible to be someplace with as little external sound as possible. And the third situation is the background. So the background, it's nice. Usually the ideal thing is to actually ask the person where they would like to do the interview, and it should ideally be on their, that they should set the place rather than you. It doesn't always work out ideally because you might arrive there with something really noisy is going on, or there's tons of people around, or things can go wrong. But the basic thing is, in their home, if it's comfortable for them, in a nice place. If they like to do it outside, in a nice place outside that perhaps they can recommend to you. And you want to think of the background also, if it's a professor, then you want to have him perhaps in his office with his books. If it's a scientist, you might want to have them in their lab. If it's an activist, you might want to have them in a squat. Whatever it is, You want to also use the background to give some context without it becoming overwhelming. And you also want to think about the setup. So this is kind of what I referred to before. Where do you want the interviewee to be looking? And it can be a little bit complicated based on whether you're controlling the camera, whether you have another camera person. Do you want them to look at the camera, past the camera to you? So I mean, one standard kind of setup might be, so I mean, what usually happens, I mean, sometimes you'll be doing an interview and you say to them, look at the camera, or whatever, right? But they won't look at the camera. Somebody, if you're interviewing somebody, they will always look in the eyes of the person that is asking them the questions. And I mean, regardless where you tell them to look, they will do this, you know? So it can be, I mean, if you have somebody else manning the camera, for example, and you know, the camera woman is here, and then the interview is sitting here, and you say, oh yeah, look over there, their eyes are constantly going to be darting. This has happened before also, and it ends up looking really funny. That they're constantly like looking at, they're like switching back and forth, very confused. So yeah, you should try to have a setup where they can look at the person asking the questions, and whether it's a bit to the right of the camera, or a bit to the left of the camera, or whatever it is, you know. So sometimes like you'll place yourself right next, if you're not doing the camera, then you place yourself right next to the camera person, so on and so forth. So just, yeah, keep that in mind. They're basically going to be looking at you. And I forget who was it that I read that they used this one director that he wanted them to look directly into the camera, but since you can't like actually be on top of the camera, he used this like crazy technique. I forget what it was with like, I'll find out and I'll tell you guys. There was some crazy thing, but it was very, very complex. I think it might be Werner Herzog that does it, because I think he might use that technique of talking into the camera. I mean, if you are holding the camera yourself, sometimes that can work, where you say, talk into the camera, and if that's the look that you're going for, it's a different style. I mean, it's in some ways it's more intimate. It's kind of like a presenter style, and it can work sometimes. I mean, I have done it in the past, and I like it also, even though sometimes they'll say, tell the interviewee not to look into the camera, tell them to look to the side of the frame. I think it depends. Another possibility is group interviews, where you have several people and you're interviewing them at once, and it can be a little bit like a dialogue, and it's a very interesting way to interview also, and I think it can often work well because you have the opportunity for interaction between them. You can also have, you know, less structured interviews where you're having kind of like a family having dinner perhaps, and you have them, you know, you can ask them questions over dinner and see how they discuss things. Another interview.
Sorry, question related to groups interviews. So suppose you have one or two cameras, so two different situations. And you have like a group interview, and then suddenly someone else comes from a village or a house or something, and start talking like this and starting to intervene in the debate, and you're like, so just move the camera, or so in this situation you have only one, and maybe the microphone is directed to the group.
Yeah.
You're like, come on, I cannot record you, so or come into the screen, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, what do you do? And what do you do if you have two cameras? So one can still stay there to the group, and the other one moves and
yeah. I mean, if you have two cameras, you're generally gonna. You guys can't see my pictures here, okay? If you have blackboard. Huh?
There is a blackboard.
Ah, the whiteboard. I'm not a very good artist, anyways. Okay, let me try. Yeah, if you have two cameras, it's not such a big problem because. Sorry?
no, the white side of the.
You want me to make it bigger? Here's where our interview is, and here's our two cameras, let's say. Yeah, so you should have kind of, you have two cameras, you want the cameras to be like in a diagonal, right? So this camera is capturing this guy talking to that guy, and this camera is capturing this guy and the reaction shots of this guy talking to that guy. So then your third guy comes up. Then you have your third guy. With two cameras, it's not such a big problem because this camera can just move and then film both of these two, right? If you only have one, first of all, well, I mean, it really depends how structured or what type of scene your interview is. Like, from what it's sounding like is that it's not that structured. So maybe it might not be such a big deal if you just, do some handheld moving, somebody's talking and you just pan over if it's interesting and you try to capture what he's saying. And then when the next person talks, you pan over to them and catch what they're saying. I mean, if it's a closed group interview, you shouldn't have that problem, but if you want it to be more like a free-for-all, which sometimes you get really great material that way, like that's kind of the best. It's like, village discussion, and everybody comes in and starts yelling about something, and it's really, motivating. Although, I mean, I think sometimes you want to differentiate that type of shooting from, depending on how it's structured, but it could also be slightly different from a formal interview. Kind of a mix between an interview and what we call a vox populi, or streeters. Streeters is kind of like, it's generally the sort of man on the street idea. And it's quite, it's often used as like, what does the common man think about fracking? Let's go ask in the community of, somewhere in the Marcellus Shale, and then you just go up to people on the street and you say, hey, have you heard about this? Do you know what this is? Or, and you kind of get regular people to get their opinion. It can work. It's another interview technique. So what you're talking about is a bit of a mixture between this type of filming on the street type of interview to get the general opinion and a more structured interview. I think you need to be flexible if you want to get, I think the main idea is that, as I said, you need to be flexible to get the best shot. So if somebody comes up and starts talking, like saying something really interesting, without offending the other people, you might lose a few seconds of whatever it is they're saying, whatever it is he's saying, but you have to decide in that moment, am I going to move my camera or not? So that's kind of, you always have to make these decisions like in this, in the split second. Like I'm filming one thing, but something else is happening over there. Do I break? Do I break my shot? Do I cut and film the other thing?
Yeah. Another short question is, in this kind of group interview, sometimes it happens that the person speaks and let's say that the focus of the interview is on him or her, and then suddenly maybe the person sitting next to him or to her starts doing something or starts talking to somebody else, and you're lost. The camera is always there, you're recording everything, and this other guy just attracts the attention.
That's not okay. That's not okay. You need to lay down the law. You need to.
So in this cases,
you should say something. You say,
hey, we are doing something here.
No, I think that. Well, that's another reason. Sometimes it's nice to do interviews with kind of like where there's a lot of things happening around, it's a street scene, but at the same time, if it's an important interview, depending on the importance of the interview, if it's a really important interview, then you might want to find someplace more private, where you won't be disturbed, or not do a group interview if the other person might not be totally, I mean, it really depends on this, I mean, the importance that you give to setting up the interviews and how you film it should be related to how important that material is for you. So that's why when you're filming a vox populi on the street, it doesn't really matter if something happens, because there's an endless number of men on the street that you could get the opinion of, you know. But if it's the main subject of your film, then you want to make sure to do it at the right time of day, because you don't want the light to change, which is something that's very, very important to keep into mind. If you're filming in the evening, which is the nicest part, which is, I mean, the nicest hours to film is often like the dawn and the evening. And if the interview goes on for a long time in the evening, the light starts to change. Then you need to either change your settings, compensate for it, or you're going to have a dimming light, for example, right? So you want to have, you know, if it's for an important interview, you want to arrange to do it at the exact right time, like the early evening. So I would say.
But technically, how can you?
That's not technical.
Let's say no. If you
technical, it's kind of like
no. This is not technical. But the technical part is when you have a shooting with an interview and somebody else doing something else, but you need that.
Just
shooting.
cut them out of the shots. Just
zooming in.
Yeah, readjust your camera, reframe the camera. Okay, you can also do walk and talks. So sometimes it's more natural to have the person actually doing something like going about their daily chores, or, you know, on their way to work, or whatever it is, and you can interview them while they're walking around. As I said, this is good if you're quite steady with the camera, or if you have a shoulder mount or a steady cam or something like that. Otherwise, you might not want to try. Or, you know, what's also very good is wheelchairs and shopping carts. Maybe not for going long distances, but if you want to get nice, smooth, dolling shots, that's what we always used to use in film school. So that's things to think about if you want to get some certain types of nice moving shots that are going to be smooth. You can use different, even a bicycle, even you can use a bicycle. Be careful. Yeah, and before you do the interview with somebody, just to put them at ease, you should explain to them that if you make a mistake, if you fumble, don't worry about it. Start your sentence again. It's not a problem. Everything's going to be edited. I'm only probably going to use about 1% or 5% of what we discussed today. And, you know, there'll be images put on top. So don't, you know, you want to, as much as possible, try to put them at ease. Okay. I have a lot. I have another slide as well as this one, all on interview tips. So I'm going to try to go a bit quickly.
Half an hour.
Sorry?
No, we have half an hour.
How much time do we have? Till 5:30, no?
Half an hour.
Oh, we have until 5?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And we have to leave at 5, not finish at 5, leave at 5.
No, I mean, it's okay if we.
Okay, I'll
We
finish
just
this
need
in
to
10
move
minutes. I'm just going to go through very quickly more interviewing tips. Okay, how to prepare for the interview. Slide 2, and there's one more slide, but the last slide is just like, I think, a summary. So, preparing for your questions. Personally, I don't like to read questions when I am doing an interview. I find it's, I don't know, it's a bit distracting or whatnot. So what I will normally do is I prepare all my questions, I basically memorize them. I ask the questions in as natural a way as I can, really following the interview, you know, following on from what he's saying in an order that seems logical, picking up on other points that you want him to add to. And then at the end, before the interview's over, I run through my list of questions. Some of them will already be answered anyways because they've answered them within their questions. And the other ones I just decide, is it still worth it at this point to ask? And then you ask the remaining questions. So I recommend that technique, not to rely too much on a script. It just seems more natural if you're there like reading the questions. It just, I don't know, for me I find it a bit awkward, you know? Depending on whether you're going to include, this is very key, happens all the time. Depending on whether you're going to include your voice or not into the script, whether you want yourself to appear as asking the questions or not, you always need to ask the interviewer to answer in full questions. So if you say, how old were you when this and this happened? If they answer 15, that's not very useful unless you include your question. So before the interview, and even you might have to remind them again throughout the interview because people normally will forget, you have to ask them to answer in full questions like, oh, this happened to me when I was 15. And yeah, you might have to do it several times. So sometimes I'll interrupt them and I'll say, oh, sorry, can you please answer that in a full question? And I mean, it might or might not be something that you have decided in advance of whether you plan to include your own voice or not. So I mean, it is a safety tactic just to tell the person, please answer in full questions, and then you're covered either way. So yeah, what you want to do is to kind of draw out stories and anecdotes and opinions and feelings from people. I mean, unless it's just kind of a hard and fast scientific interview where you just want to get basic details from somebody, the elements of interviews that will work best are stories that really illustrate. So a good way to do this is to kind of maybe perhaps move through things chronologically, you know, ask them, oh, how did you get involved in this? What was it like then? Can you tell me a story about X? So on and so forth. So you really want to try to draw out those types of stories. If you ask a question and you don't like the way they've answered it or the way they've said it, you can ask it again, even if it's the exact same question. And you will they will often give you a different answer. So this is a tactic I use all the time. And I mean, it's not a problem. Like, they realize that you're asking them again, or you can just frame it slightly differently. But it's quite useful. Don't be afraid to play the devil's advocate. I mean, I think something that's very important when you're interviewed, that I have in my next slide, is this idea of, you know, you don't need to impress the person. So sometimes a lot of people kind of they try to they gush a bit or impress the person, or, oh, don't you think this? And I agree with you so much. I think that it doesn't lend itself so well to great interviewees. Sometimes you will get better questions if you kind of are slightly more challenging and slightly more provocative. So that's this idea of playing the devil's advocate, because you're basically challenging them to answer something in a more adversarial way. They might give a more powerful response. And then one of the absolute best tricks for interviewing is to leave silences. Actually, when people get uncomfortable, especially once the silence grows uncomfortable, they will kind of rush to fill the void with saying something. And those are the moments when you can sometimes get the best comments, because they're actually trying to please you, you know? So they've kind of given their speech, they've delivered it, and then you say nothing. And in their head, they're just like, oh, what have I not said? Or what can I say that will make it better? And that's when you'll often get the best nuggets, when you just say nothing. So don't be afraid to allow silence after they answer a question, and just see what happens. So there's a bit of a debate about whether you should or you should not interrupt. And I think that I mean, generally, it really depends. I think you need to take it on a case-by-case basis. It really depends on your relationship with the interviewer, the timing, the way they're speaking, everything. But to protect yourself, you can just tell them from the outset. I might have to interrupt you for whatever reason. Please don't, take it the wrong way or whatever it is. So that then you can kind of give yourself carte blanche to interrupt without being rude. Although it can be very difficult sometimes to interrupt. Sometimes you can they'll just go on and on and on. And it's like, okay. And if they make a mistake or they fumble on some words, don't worry. I mean, as I said, everything can be edited. So, just tell them, oh, that's no problem. You can repeat your sentence again and never feel, it's always fun that you can make them feel like they can repeat something again. It's not a problem. It's like if something went wrong the first time, if they tripped over their words, and then you could say, oh, would you like to start again? Or, oh, this happened. Would you like to say that again? And they might say something differently, whatever the case is, but it's not a problem. Okay, these ones we've already talked a bit about. I mean, there's obviously differences between confrontational interviews and interviews with, subjects that you're perhaps more sympathetic with, but we won't get into detail about this. Maintain eye contact. So you want to always maintain eye contact with the person that you're interviewing with and to give them visual signs, not verbal signs. Like, I took my mother once to do interviews with me, and the whole time she was going, Oh, actually, Joanne did it too. Joanne also, be very careful who you take with you to your interviews. Joanne was doing it also, remember, and you tell them to stop, but they can't stop because they're like, they really want to hear what the person's saying, and they're really, they really get into it, and then it's like, and then you say, yeah, can you just not make a noise? But then eventually they just start again. So yeah, that's another point. Be very careful when you have, bystanders with you. But you should give them signs that you're listening to what they're saying. Oh, go on. If you're confused about something, you want them to elaborate something more, you can make a face like, oh, what are you talking about? You see? Like that, so you can give visual cues and feedback. As I said, you want to kind of try to elicit stories. So tell me about this time. What was it like back then? Really try to draw the stories and specific details. A narrative thrives on this type of specific details of, oh, what did it smell like then when we woke up in the mornings and it was cold? Then these very specific details are much more powerful tools for storytelling. And then, very important point, when you're finished, ask the subject if there's anything you missed or there's anything that they would like to add. And 95% of the time they will add something, and it's usually something that you hadn't thought of, or something that's interesting, or something that potentially could be like, oh, I need to do the whole interview over again, which is why you might want to do pre-interviews. Especially in the pre-interview, you should also say, is there anything that I'm missing out on here? Is there an aspect of the story I'm not covering? If you have the opportunity to do the pre-interview, it's also a good chance to ask those questions. Okay, I think I've gone through most of these. Keep your questions open and simple. Try to avoid leading questions, or, I personally don't like it when people ask really long questions like, oh, and I think that this and 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 this is, oh, don't you agree? Don't ask yes or no questions. This is another point. I usually begin all interviews by having the person present themselves and what they do and everything on camera. And it's also a form of consent as well. If you don't have them sign a consent release form, that's functions as a form of consent. Oh, and this is a good trick, but I don't really do it, but I should do it, is to keep the camera rolling even after the interview ends, because actually that's when sometimes people loosen up and they make the actual best comments. You find that because then the interview is over and you start having some kind of, oh yeah, I do it sometimes. So you start having some kind of more informal conversation. It's like, seems like the interview is over, and then they kind of discuss things in a different way, and you can get some good material that way. It's also nice if your documentary is about one thematic idea, you can kind of ask the same question to all the people, and then show the different responses. So you might have like one or two kind of key thematic questions that you will ask to everybody. Always be ready to shift gears if things change. You just have to, really listen to what they're saying so you don't miss out on, a key, maybe there's something you hadn't thought of, and there's a key kind of detour, and if you just stick to your questions, you're going to miss out on it. So just be prepared to kind of go with the flow. Okay, and that's what I said. These shot cutaways and close-ups and whatever, you can shoot it after the interview. Oh, the other thing is that setting up for the interview can take some time to get the shot really right. So what I will do, if you're filming with somebody else, then one person should keep, because the person needs to kind of stay there. Well, there's two ways to do it. If you're two people, then you can have one of you kind of sit in for if you don't want the interviewer, because it can take some time, and sometimes you feel a bit bad about having the interviewer to have to sit there for quite some time while you're setting up. So if you're with two people, you or your other person can sit in for the interviewer while you kind of set up the shot more or less, and set up the frame and the exposure and get everything right. And then when it's more or less right, you have the interviewee come and sit down, and then you adjust the IE to whatever it is. And it's always nice, if one person is setting up the camera, that the other person kind of warms them up and talks to them, or, because it's one of those like slightly weird moments, like setting up for the interview. So that's it for interviewing. I hope that those tips will be helpful to you. And I guess the main thing I can say here is that interviewing for documentaries is very, very different than interviewing for research, because most of the types of questions that you would want people to say for research would be really technical, or kind of like the way we ask questions, we kind of assume a basic knowledge because we're researchers and we're not coming to the scene with almost no knowledge. When you're shooting a documentary, of course you have knowledge, you have done research on the subject, but you have to assume that your audience has almost no knowledge of the subject, so you want to put yourself in their shoes, and you want to be a little bit naive sometimes. That's part of this idea about not kind of worrying about coming off as being too intelligent or whatever it is, Sometimes you want to ask these, which I had a hard time with this also, that I found that I didn't always ask the most basic questions. And the most basic questions is just, somehow the why, how, what, where, who, and almost from a perspective is if you know absolutely nothing. So that's, something I had to unlearn in a way of like, okay, you don't need to appear as being somebody with a ton of knowledge about the subject. Later on in the interview, you can show that knowledge in order to, get at some specific details, perhaps that you want to talk about. But from the beginning, you should kind of start off from a more naive perspective. Put yourself in your viewer's shoes. Yeah.
Do you do multiple takes, for instance, if, because not everybody's great in front of the camera and they tend to tense up? And in the first few answers, sometimes they just feel like they bungled it up and want to redo it. Do you just keep it rolling, or how do you handle such situations?
Yeah, there's a few things. If you feel that the person is kind of tense, you can kind of try to ask some simple warm-up questions, perhaps, that, you know, to get them out of the way. Then, if I didn't like the answer that I got at the beginning, I'll re-ask it at the end. And, as I said, if they fumble, you can always just say, oh, would you like to repeat that? Or can we take that again from the top? Because a bug flew by. You can make up lots of excuses, like, oh, there was an ant there, nah. Do you think we could record that again? So you don't have to, like, make them feel that the mistake was theirs. Okay, any other questions? Oh, so then, these are a few other issues, but we don't really have time to discuss them because I would rather hear about your wonderful documentary ideas. So, if anybody has any questions about any of these points, or you want me to send you any specific information, I have like a budgeting, I can send you an example of a budget form. I think we discussed a little bit some questions about equipment. We discussed interviewing. As far as proposals, we're working on them. I sent you kind of like some guidelines of what Sundance and what other funds want. As far as like getting funding and submitting to festivals and online crowdfunding and things like this, we don't really have time to discuss it today. But if there's any specific questions, then
can I ask one question about funding for first timers? Is it difficult? I mean, it's like entering the job market when you have never had a job and you have a CV without any job, and it's kind of tough to get in.
yeah.
Is it the same for getting like funding for your first proposal, for example?
Oh, it's fun. It's difficult for everybody, not only for first timers.
Are there tricks for first timers to grant?
What country are you from?
Huh?
What country are you from? To be honest, I mean, it really depends on the national context. I mean, different countries have different funding schemes that are better and not better. And, you know, I'm familiar with some degree for, like, you know, if you want to pitch a documentary, you can go to pitching sessions at different documentary festivals, or you can try to find funds, you know, if you wanted to make a documentary in collaboration with an NGO or something like that. But if you just want to find funding for a documentary project, like an artistic documentary project, then I know the Canadian context, for example, through the Canada Council for the Arts is one example, so they have funds. Not for, I mean, a lot of funding will only be for artistic documentaries. So, I mean, those 4 categories that we saw, the first one, which would be like the authoritative documentary, which is more information-based, arts funding will not cover that type of documentary. They will only cover more creative, artistic, reflexive types of documentary projects that are really based more from a personal story, you know? And at least in Canada is the context, and I don't know in other countries, but yeah, I mean, you would need to look into the options in Germany. I think that would be your best bet, depending on your proposal and what your idea is. And yeah, crowdfunding is, of course, a lot of people use it nowadays, but it's quite a lot of work. It's a whole other course, one-day course. Yeah?
Are there any questions? Other questions?
Okay, so we're going to have some presentations now.